everyone, and a very happy Victober to you. I hope you are just having the most lovely Victorian reading sessions during this month. And I am doing a somewhat unusual video today. I finally settled upon the name of a Victorian literature taste tester for this. Earlier in the year, I think it was in February, so a ways back in 2019, I read for my Victorian book club Dr. Wardle's School by Anthony Trollope. And as I was reading it, something about it struck me that the kind of basic template for the book was it was really interesting to think about how other Victorian authors would have handled this plot and storyline. So I will be keeping this video spoiler-free for Dr. Wardle's School. Never fear if you have not read Dr. Wardle's School. And let's just get started. So the basic non-spoilery plot for Dr. Wardle's School is there is a Dr. Wardle who runs a school for boys, and he hires a Mr. Peacock who comes with his wife, Mrs. Peacock, to work at the school. A little ways into the plot, it is found out there is some sort of secret that Mr. and Mrs. Peacock have, and people don't know what the secret is. And there's a certain turn of events where Mr. Peacock wants to see that, with the information that he has, that things will be okay. He needs to investigate certain things. He travels to America and investigates things, and as Anthony Trollope does, he gives us a happy ending. And so things turn out all right for the Peacocks, and everyone is happy in the end. So we're going to do a little taste tester then. If there are some Victorian authors on this list that you haven't read, this will maybe give you a good idea of what exactly their plots are like, kind of how they do their stories. And the first author I have on this list is Charles Dickens. So if Charles Dickens had written Dr. Wardle's School, this is a, what is that called? A Cliff Notes plot synopsis. In Dickens' version of this tale, it is 1,000 pages long. And Dr. Wardle runs the school in London. Along with hiring Mr. Peacock to work for him, a certain bumbling Mr. Wopsit is a ward of the school taken in by the good graces of Dr. Wardle. The school is growing, and Dr. Wardle needs to hire an additional teacher, Mr. Sneeringe. Mr. Sneeringe becomes aware, through sneaking and lurking about, of Mr. and Mrs. Peacock's secret and begins to blackmail them. Mr. Wopsit is actually cleverer than many believe him to be, and he is able to obtain evidence of Mr. Sneeringe's blackmail and past misdeeds at the previous school he worked at. Mr. Wopsit informs Dr. Wardle of Sneeringe's misdeeds, and Sneeringe is dismissed in a very public scene, while Mr. and Mrs. Peacock stay at the school and live happily ever after, and have Mr. Wopsit be a godfather to their 7 children. So yeah, that's, if you haven't read Dickens yet, that's a kind of good idea of what his stories are like and the character names, what they're like. And he's a bit extra, Mr. Dickens, but I love him for it. Thomas Hardy is next on the list. In this modest 400-page novel, Dr. Wardle's School is set in Hardy's fictional county of Wessex. Mr. and Mrs. Peacock fear the worst if their secret is found out by Dr. Wardle. Mr. Peacock has several secret meetings in wooded cover of darkness with a Mr. Eldridge, a man he has met in town at a pub, to see if documentation of their secret can be totally destroyed. Mr. and Mrs. Peacock take many walks in the beautiful woods and discover deep truths about themselves through their connection to the woodlands. Eventually, on a stormy night, Mr. Peacock realizes Mr. Eldridge has kept documentation of his secret and plans on revealing it to Dr. Wardle. Mr. Peacock rides out on his horse to track him down before his secret is revealed. He confronts Mr. Eldridge in the midst of the storm at the bottom of a ravine. The torrential rains cause a sudden landslide in which Mr. Peacock is crushed. Mr. Eldridge carries him home, and Mrs. Peacock is able to be with Mr. Peacock in his last moments. Mrs. Peacock then travels off to America to try to make a new life for herself. Next on the list is Emily Bronte. So I did not include Charlotte and Anne because I didn't know if I could do them justice. And since I thought Emily was kind of the most exaggerated, she would be the most fun to kind of come up with a plot for. So in Emily Bronte's tale, Dr. Wardle's School is set on the moors. The Peacocks become more and more unsettled as they live in the school. They have even thought they may have seen a ghost in the window. They start to have miscommunications between them, and resentment mounts. Then a long-lost love, Mr. Andrews, from Mrs. Peacock's past, arrives as a new teacher at the school. Mr. Peacock figures it out soon. Mrs. Peacock's heart is divided between the two men. Eventually, a letter is sent to Dr. Wardle revealing the secret of the Peacocks, and he has dismissed them from his school. In her distress at never seeing her first love again, Mrs. Peacock goes to wander the moors. A thunderstorm of epic proportions happens, and Mr. Andrews finds Mrs. Peacock, and she shares a tender moment with him before dying of brain fever 2 weeks later. Next on the list, I have included Wilkie Collins and Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I'm including them in one because their plots are very similar how they would do them. Mary Elizabeth Braddon said, she loved Wilkie Collins' writing. That was kind of who she strived to be like. So, a man with 2 different colored eyes and a crooked nose and an avaricious nature named Mr. Nightshade comes to see Mr. Peacock. He is from Mr. Peacock's past, and he comes to the school and threatens to reveal the Peacock's secret unless they pay him absorbent amounts of money. He gives Mr. Peacock 1 week to pay up. They meet under cover of darkness during a thunderstorm the following week. Mr. Peacock pleads with Mr. Nightshade to give him longer. Mr. Nightshade refuses to give him longer and starts to walk away from Mr. Peacock to go reveal the secret to Dr. Wardle. In his panic, Mr. Peacock strikes Mr. Nightshade on the head with a rock and accidentally kills him. He then gets Mrs. Peacock to help him hide the body in an abandoned mill. They spend the following weeks living paranoid of discovery. Eventually, they confess to Dr. Wardle. Mrs. Peacock is put in an asylum, whereas Mr. Peacock is sent to prison. The next author on the list is George Eliot. So we'll see if I have given George Eliot justice in her take on Dr. Wardle's school. In this 800-page novel, the Peacocks managed to keep their secret hidden for many years. Mr. Peacock is a very respected member of the community and desires to make the world a better place. He has written several treatises on how more aid should be given to the poor. Throughout this novel, we would see references to dozens of obscure philosophers and rabbit trails into ancient history, and it's honestly quite dense and slow-going. Mr. Peacock decides to run for mayor against a corrupt lord who has held the post for far too long and is using his power to only benefit the already wealthy members of the community. On the night before the election, a long-lost acquaintance arrives in town and reveals Mr. Peacock's secret in a public forum. Mr. and Mrs. Peacock pack up and try to forge a new life for themselves in the north of England. And then lastly is Elizabeth Gaskell. Now, Elizabeth Gaskell's plot is going to be almost identical to George Eliot's. I feel that their plots actually are very similar. That hadn't occurred to me before, but then once I started to write it, I realized, oh yeah, their plots are kind of similar. It's just how they tell it that's very different. So in Elizabeth Gaskell's, it says, in this novel, the Peacocks managed to keep their secret hidden for many years. Mr. Peacock is a very respected member of the community and decides to make the world a better place. He has written several treatises on how more aid should be given to the poor. In this time, we grow to know and love the Peacocks. We are aware of their secret, and even if we feel they shouldn't be hiding things, we still have a great affection for them. We've become familiar with their little idiosyncrasies and patterns of speech. So he decides to run for mayor against a corrupt lord who has held the post for far too long and is using his power to only benefit the already wealthy members of the community. On the night before the election, a long-lost acquaintance arrives in town and reveals Mr. Peacock's secret in a public forum. Mr. and Mrs. Peacock pack up and try to forge a new life for themselves in the north of England. So I wasn't sure, I was trying to think of another ending that either George Eliot or Elizabeth Gaskell would have done. I couldn't come up with a different ending, so I kind of thought it would be in the telling that I would have, something be different. I hope you all enjoyed this kind of unusual video. If you had ideas for how Anne Bronte or Charlotte Bronte would have done this, or I have not read any Thackeray. Hopefully this October I will, at least read Vanity Fair. And I'm sure there are other authors I could have included, but these are the ones that I have the most experience with reading. I hope you all enjoyed that, and I will be back for another Victober video soon.